It's been a great pleasure for me to participate in this conference, as well as the study process that led up to it. I've been impressed by the way that we have struggled to listen to each other. In terms of ecclesiastical traditions, I think this has been more comprehensive than any similar conference held in the past 100 years. But in terms of the composition of this conference, I can't help feeling that we have not progressed very far beyond Edinburgh 1910. The proportion of women has only slightly increased. Young people are virtually absent. Many of the Africans and Asians in this room seem to have made their homes in the global north. So can this gathering be considered truly representative of the world church? And except for Dana Roberts' opening address, I confess that I haven't sensed the passion and the deep accountability to God for the gospel that resonates through many of the 1910 reports. However, this evening I want to highlight another rather massive blind spot concerning mission, which prevails in many of our churches, and I can't help feeling this conference has tended to perpetuate. We seem to have forgotten that the primary way the church impacts the world is not through church programs or by multiplying religious professionals or starting more mission societies and ecumenical commissions, but rather through the daily work of ordinary Christian men and women in offices, in factories, in schools, in village councils, in research laboratories, in parliaments, in corporation boardrooms, and so on. Those are the contemporary sites of Christian mission. And yet all the speakers who have addressed us during this conference have been religious professionals, bishops and senior pastors, seminary professors or leaders of Christian institutions. And we seem to talk only with one another and publish papers for one another to read. But are we really listening to the millions of Christians who are following Jesus and witnessing to Jesus in the secular world? I was in Malaysia a few months ago, and I spent a memorable morning with a group of committed Christian members of the Malaysian Parliament. They represented different opposition political groups in that country. They came from a variety of church traditions, including Roman Catholic and Pentecostal. And I asked them, what is the biggest source of frustration that you face in your work? I expected them to say something like, well, the compromises that we need to make as party members. But all of them were unanimous in their answer. They said, our churches. They did not receive any support from their churches, whether in the form of regular prayer, financial assistance, or volunteers to help them in implementing social policies or even simply running their offices. One woman MP told me that her church raised huge funds to send cross-cultural missionaries and young people on short-term mission trips to other parts of Asia. But their work as politicians was not considered as mission. The only time that church leaders showed any interest in what they did was when Christians themselves suffered political harassment. Now, this is a story that's repeated all over the world. My wife and I work primarily with Christians in secular occupations, helping them to live out the gospel and communicate God's truth and God's justice in the fields of science, technology, business, the arts, medicine, education, and so on. These men and women who engage Christianly with the public square, they, I believe, are at the cutting edge of mission. They face huge ethical challenges thrown up by, say, new medical technologies or new social networking media. genetic engineering, venture capitalism and hedge funds, anti-terrorist legislation, euthanasia, climate change and biodiversity loss. All these call for deep missionary engagement and missiological reflection. India and China produce more science and engineering graduates every year than Western Europe and North America combined. But the mission studies dissertations and the bulk of articles that you would find in mission studies journals focus on historical studies of religious sects and denominations, traditional tribal cultures, or exotic new religious movements. It seems that we've been blinded by the neat divisions that we have drawn between theology, ethics, and mission. And I want to suggest that these divisions or boundaries need to be deconstructed, not obliterated. We've been reminded in recent years that all theology is mission theology, that the church does theology on the road and not just in the library or the pulpit. But then theological education has to be reoriented radically around the lives and the work of so-called lay people and not the agendas of clergy or traditional mission societies. Because today social and political ethics has become the locus of evangelical proclamation. We need to go further and deconstruct the boundary between clergy and laity. Clericalism has crippled our witness as a church. There are many thoughtful people who are profoundly attracted to Jesus, but frankly put off, even repelled by what they see of the church. They see a lack of integrity, a huge gulf between the message that we proclaim and the way, especially our leaders, behave, not least towards each other. How did a socially subversive, egalitarian movement centered in worshipping and following a crucified Jew change so quickly into another hierarchical, patriarchal, and often anti-Semitic religious institution? That's an old question, but it's a question that we need to keep coming back to in the younger churches as much as in the older churches. We in Asia and Africa cannot keep blaming Christendom. I'm often amused by how many of our southern bishops and clergy who bitterly condemn Western Christendom cling so tenaciously to titles and status honor and forms of address and even dress that they have inherited from Christendom. In my experience, it is so-called lay men and women of different church backgrounds who rarely have problems working together in facing common concerns. Lay Christians work together in offices and schools and universities. They have no sacred turf to protect. Remember that John Arbott, the architect of the 1910 Edinburgh Conference, was himself a layman. It was his experience of working with the student volunteer movement and the YMCAs that laid the ecumenical groundwork for that conference. If left to church leaders and church-based mission societies, Edinburgh 1910 is unlikely to have happened. And if, as Dana Roberts reminded us on the first morning of this conference, one of the unintended consequences of Edinburgh 1910 was the dismantling of the boundaries between so-called Christian nations and non-Christian nations, can we pray that one of the consequences of this conference will be the steady erosion of clergy-laity boundaries and the recovery of the priesthood of all believers? And can we also pray that during the next 100 years, these boundaries between so-called ecumenicals and evangelicals and charismatics and Pentecostals, that those artificial boundaries will also be eroded? But for that, we may have to be more intentional than our forebears. Thank you.